on this beautiful Sunday. We're almost done with this series of The Guardian, almost at the finish line, and it's been quite a story until now. An amazing history brought together by an amazing person, Miss Violetta Zane, who's here with us as we begin our session this afternoon. Now, a quick introduction for all of you who are just jumping in and you haven't seen this before. You are more than welcome to start from here. But of course, we welcome you as well to look at the beautiful chronology of The Guardian, which started a few months ago. Now, a quick intro. Ms. Violetta Zane is an artist and graphic designer living in Pointe-Noire. She is the co-creator with Adib Masumian of the Utterance Project. And she has given many talks on Baha'i history in English and French here on the Clearwater YouTube channel and elsewhere. She has written 4 illustrated chronologies covering the lives of Bahā'u'lláh, the Bab, Abdul Baha, and Shoghi Effendi. So with that being said, as we all know that you can find this chronology on the Utterance Project website, you're more than welcome to compare that and look more into the stories, along with this beautiful narrative that Violetta will be, again, almost finishing. So how many more weeks do we have left, Violetta?
We only have this Sunday and next Sunday, and then I will not see you again until my next chronology, which is close to being completed.
Well, it's thousands of hours, we understand. And we are so happy that we have all these other chronologies of the central figures available to us. Those of us who are joining haven't seen The Guardian. Again, the whole Guardian chronology, the one for the Bab, Abdul Baha, Bahā'u'lláh, it's a lot. And we really appreciate that. So hopefully those of you joining can share all this. And we would definitely appreciate those who have yet to become impassioned with the story of the central figures to do exactly that, to investigate, discover, and fall in love with them just as you have, Violetta. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Those were the first words Abdul Baha spoke to the Baha'is in Haifa who had been waiting for him for 3 long years as he returned on the 5th of December, 1913. We are all welcome here to relish in the last year of the Guardian's life. And I want to take a minute before I start screen sharing and jumping in, just to acknowledge that the Bab, of course, was martyred when he was 31. But Bahā'u'lláh and Abdul Baha lived very long lives into old age. And the thing they have in common is that their lives did not diminish in intensity as they approached the time of their end on this earthly life. And though the Guardian passed away when he was 60, his life was intense to the very end. And I want to tell you a little secret. When I was writing the chronology, and I was always trying to find the best titles for parts, and I usually titled the parts the main thing that happens in that part. So last week, it was the Temple Land, there was the institution of the Hands of the Cause, there was the Dawnbreakers, and God Passes By. And I originally titled part 20, The Last Momentous Year in Shoghi Effendi's Life. And as soon as I typed those words, I felt very, very sad, because I felt like that was not honoring Shoghi Effendi. So instead, I called part 20 the International Bahá'í Archives, because that is the major thing that happened in the last years of the Guardian's life. And with that, I'm going to start telling you the story of this extraordinary year. The Guardian, Part 20, 1956 to 1957, the International Bahá'í Archives. This part covers the life of Shoghi Effendi from the age of 59 in 1956 to the age of 60 in 1957. Riḍván, 1956. The achievements of Phase 2 of the 10 Year Crusade. 16 February 1956, the Guardian's teaching advice. This woman you see here is named Gail Wolfson. She's a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of South America. She became a Knight of Baha'u'lláh for the Galapagos Islands. And she served, at the time you could do this, she served both on the National Spiritual Assembly and as an auxiliary board member. She came on pilgrimage on the 16th of February, 1956, and the Guardian spoke to her at length about effective teaching. He said and emphasized that the Baha'is had to develop spiritually and arise to teach others. And he mentioned his favorite place. He mentioned how it was done in Africa. The Guardian also warned the pilgrims, along with Gail, that conversion should not be the goal of a Baha'i teacher, but rather that they should teach with determination and patience and never become discouraged if the progress was slow. Then he spoke about indigenous peoples. Attract them through friendliness and kindness. Give them preference in everything. Not only equality, but preference and preferential treatment. Teaching indigenous peoples is very important. The Baha'is must treat them just the opposite of the way others treat them. Among the Baha'is, the minorities in any country must be given preferential treatment. If there is a tie between two believers for anything, and one is part of a minority, there must not be a second vote. Preference must be given to the minority group. Riḍván, 1956. The achievements of Phase 2 of the 10 Year Crusade. A significant victory. But I'm going to show you the list of achievements and explain to you why I can't read them all. They're bullet pointed here. They go on and on and on. I am just going to read a few. By the second phase of the 10 Year Crusade, there were 3,700 localities open to the faith. 237 sovereign states and chief dependencies. 900 local spiritual assemblies. 70 islands. 40 territories open in the Pacific. 190 languages for Baha'i literature. 3,000 Baha'is in Africa. 140 tribes in Africa, 43 national Baha'i centers, endowments for national Baha'i endowments exceeded $100,000. That's $1 million today. There were 3 additional houses of worship that were planned in Europe, Africa, and Australia. The monument gardens were extended. A prayer revealed by Abdul Baha for America was presented by the elected national representatives of the United States Baha'i community to President Eisenhower. And on and on and on. It was a resounding success. And think of it, the Guardian lived to see all of these victories. And I invite you to go to the chronology and look at them. Spend time reading them and understanding what they mean to a faith that 30 years ago was not mature enough to elect a universal House of Justice because they had no national assemblies, very few local spiritual assemblies. All of that was the work of the Guardian. Riḍván 1956, same date, the Guardian's word about the International Baha'i Archives. The Guardian wrote that 30 of the 52 pillars had been raised into position and that he had placed an order for 7,000 beautiful green tiles from Utrecht factory in the Netherlands. And he gave great details for the hundreds of tons of stones that had already been delivered to Haifa, $15,000 for the contract for the tiles that would cover 500 square meters of the roof of the building. This was all in the Riḍván message of the Guardian. The end of the Guardian's Riḍván message, and I chose a picture of knights to illustrate this. The quote in the end of the Riḍván message of 1956 said, "Putting on the armor of his love, firmly buckling on the shield of his mighty covenant, mounted on the steed of steadfastness, holding aloft the lance of the word of the Lord of hosts." And I was very happy when I found a picture that had all 3 of these things. In this part of the Riḍván message, the Guardian referred to Baha'is as warriors enlisting under its banner, raised their awareness to the work yet to be done. He called them fields of exploration and consolidation of such vastness as might well dazzle the eyes and strike awe in the heart of any soul. Guardian instilled passion in everyone. Shoghi Effendi's joys and sorrows at pioneering goals lost and won. This is a photograph of Leroy Iowas's nephew, Charles Iowas, Knight of Baha'u'lláh to the Balearic Islands, which you see in the background. It's a photo of Menorca. The Guardian's heart was always with the pioneers. They were his favorite people, rising to answer the call of Baha'u'lláh, going out to serve on the front lines. And he gloried in their achievements more than he gloried in anything else. Even at the Baha'i World Center, there were ties to Knights of Baha'u'lláh and to the World Crusade. 3 of Leroy Iowas's family members rose to the rank of Knight of Baha'u'lláh. His nieces, Marguerite Ulrich Kelbert in the Dutch West Indies, Florence Ulrich Kelly in Monaco, and his nephew, Charles Iowas in the Balearic Islands. The Guardian was, you can't think of the 10-Year Crusade happening out there and the Guardian being in Haifa. The Guardian was inextricably linked with every single thing that happened in the 10-Year Crusade. What affected the 10-Year Crusade affected the Guardian personally. Whether he learned about difficulties that a pioneer was having, he felt saddened. When news of Knights of Bahā'u'lláh and pioneers' success came to the Guardian, he was overjoyed. And if they were forced to leave their post for whatever reason, he was deeply grieved. When the Hands of the Cause wrote a Riḍván message during the Ministry of the Custodians, they wrote it together. They had a very touching sentence about this unity that the Guardian felt with the 10-Year Crusade. They said, "It is not possible for us to describe the wistful sadness and the look of concern and care that would pass over his blessed face when he received news that a goal had to be abandoned and was lacking a pioneer." I'll cross the other one off later. Ruhiya Khanum remembered a particularly poignant, heartbreaking moment that shows how sensitive our beloved Guardian was when it came to losses during the 10-Year Crusade. On the very same day, Shoghi Effendi received news that 3 pioneers were forced to leave their pioneering post. Ruhiya Khanum watched as the Guardian reluctantly crossed off 2 names in his little black notebook, which he carried with him at all times. Later, Ruhiya Khanum said to Shoghi Effendi, "Shoghi Effendi, you only crossed off 2 names." Shoghi Effendi replied, "Yes, I'll cross the other one off later." The Guardian could not bear to cross all 3 at the same time. The pioneer who did not leave. One pioneer went to an island in the Pacific, and as is perfectly human, he became completely discouraged by the conditions there. He had faced failure, he had faced opposition, he could not find a job, no one wanted to listen to what he had to say, the local clergy opposed him, and he was persecuted by the government. That's a lot. He asked the Guardian permission to leave his post. And the Guardian instructed Leroy Iowes to write back, encouraging him to persevere, promising that every seed would ripen. Sometime later, the man wrote again, asking to leave. And the Guardian responded again that he should persevere. The man wrote a 3rd time, describing his dire financial situation. And the Guardian said it should be arranged with his National Spiritual Assembly for him to remain at his post, financially speaking. Well, would you know, several months later, the Guardian arrived at dinner beaming with joy and said, "We have some wonderful cables today." He shared a cable from this same pioneer. Not only had he succeeded in enrolling 50 people into the faith, but he had formed 2 local spiritual assemblies. The Guardian said, if we had let him go home, he would not have won these victories. And Leroy Iowes, very typical of him to always think of the Guardian, remarked, well, Shoghi Effendi, of course, this pioneer, yes, he did the work, but it's the Guardian that actually won the victory. You're the one that won it, because if it hadn't been for you, he would have left. The guardian responded, Leroy, that is correct. I won these victories. I won them, and I have to stay in the Holy Land. This is my seat of operation. The friends must do the work. And I tell you that if the friends would do what I had told them to do, and if they would follow my instructions, they would be amazed at the victories they will win through them. This was at the dinner table, and Leroy Iowis realized he wasn't just speaking to him, he was speaking to everyone seated at the table. But only later, years later, did Leroy Iowis realize the full import of his answer, when the guardian had passed away. When the Baha'is were winning great victories in the second half of the 10-year crusade after the passing of the guardian, Leroy, always faithful to his beloved guardian, would say, let me tell you these extraordinary victories that are being won in the second half of the crusade. Shoghi Effendi is winning them. His spirit is influencing anyone who becomes a proper vehicle for him to work through. I always like when pilgrims describe Shoghi Effendi. I feel a connection with these pen portraits of Shoghi Effendi. This woman who came on pilgrimage, we don't know her name, said that although he was nearly 60 years old, he looked like he was 48, and she gave a detailed physical description of him. His face is beautiful, as it is so pure in expression and so impersonal, yet at the same time tender and majestic. His nose is a combination of what it was in the pictures of him as a little boy. He still looks very much like that. And the sort of ridged nose of the master. He had a small graying mustache, tightly clipped. His mouth is firm and pure. His teeth are white and beautiful. His smile is a precious bounty. He is completely simple and direct. He himself does not demand all this deference, but just to be in his presence makes one feel absolutely weak and lowly. The guardian is ever courteous and does not lose patience with questions of the immature. However, he is not reticent about letting people know which questions are important and which are not, and which will be answered later by the Universal House of Justice. She did something very lovely, and that's why I have a picture of a locomotive here. She says, I felt he were like a great, powerful locomotive, pulling behind him a long, long string of cars laden with not dead weight exactly, but pretty dead. This weight is the believers. They have to be pushed, they have to be pulled, they have to be cajoled, they have to be praised at every moment to get them to take action. The beloved guardian sees far in advance the needs, the lack of time, the obstacle, and the problems. He is the one who is actually hauling us along behind his guiding and powerful light. Like a locomotive, too, he can go straight ahead, fast or slow, but he cannot deviate. I think that's very beautiful because locomotives are on rails and the guardian never deviated. So there is a lot of sensitivity in that comparison. He gives one the sense of the perfect instrument, very impersonal, but hypersensitive to every thought or atmosphere. He cannot be swayed in his thought. He is not influenced in the least by friendship, preference, money, hurting or not hurting feelings. He is absolutely above that. After November 1956, this is 1 year before his passing and a few weeks, I am tired. Tired. This is a rare photograph of Shoghi Effendi in April 1957, standing in the garden of the gate of the House of the Master. He was directing the placing of the coffin of Isfandiar, Abdul-Baha's faithful servant and carriage driver. And if you remember, Isfandiar had been very sad when the British consulate had sent this fancy, shining car to take Abdul-Baha to his knighthood. And he had been overjoyed when Abdul-Baha had come out and said, Isfandiar, let's go. He took his carriage to the knighthood, not the fancy car. He was the one who was being buried that day in April 1957. And the funeral cortege was about to leave for the Baha'i cemetery. After the 35th anniversary of the ascension of Abdul-Baha, Shoghi Effendi told Ruhiya Hanum many, many times, do you realize I have been carrying this load for 36 years. I am tired. Tired. We're going to go slightly back in time for this section. It's going to be like a mini chronology within the chronology. I put it in 1957 because I didn't want to separate all the stories having to do with the construction of the International Baha'i Archives. 1955 to 1957, the construction of the International Baha'i Archives. 1955 to 1957, Leroy Iowes, the invisible hand of God. You see here the very handsome, very tall Leroy Iowes in a beautiful suit, double-breasted suit, I think, standing on the path that leads to the International Baha'i Archives. Now, notice Shoghi Effendi's technique for building was to plant trees and grass and little trees here that would grow larger and hedges as the building was being constructed, so that it wouldn't be finished. It would look like it had been there forever because the plants would have matured. The Guardian informed Leroy Iowes, who was to supervise the work locally, as Ugo Giaccheri was supervising the work in Italy, that the building would have to be built from the rear. They wanted it to be built from the back, not from the front. And the rear backed into Mount Carmel. It backed into the mountain. And Shoghi Effendi was fitting gardens in the front so that it would be surrounded by gardens. And there was only about 5 meters leeway for the workers to work with because of the gardens. The Guardian oversaw the building project of the International Baha'i Archives, and Leroy Iowes was the project manager. And Abu Khalil, who we saw in great detail and who we fell in love with in part 16, was doing masterful work, and he was the mason. But it's fair to say that the Guardian personally handled the entire project with his characteristic originality and his independent nature and his steely determination to get everything done as immediately and efficiently as possible. Remember the locomotive on the tracks, never losing focus. The process was incredibly complicated. The International Baha'i Archives was on a sloping hill. It wasn't on a flat surface, not on a level terrain. All 52 columns arrived from Italy in 3 segments that would be like snapped together like Lego bricks. And they had to be perfectly slotted for them to be perfect. Every hurdle was overcome thanks to Leroy Iowes' strength and ingenuity in Haifa and Ugo Giaccheri's brilliant problem-solving capabilities in Italy. He was both diplomatic and lovable, and had a great attention to detail. So the Guardian was, in this last year of his life, surrounded by two gems, Leroy Iowis and Ugo Giaccheri, and Abu Khalil, of course. But of course, they were all exhausted to their limits. Leroy Iowis was a very hands-on person. He wasn't an administrator. He was definitely hands-on. One day, the nephew of Hand of the Coast Tarazullah Samandari was watching the construction, and he noticed that the head mason, so Abu Khalil, and his men were working on a problem. And he saw Leroy Iowis go over there to demonstrate to them how they should fix this masonry problem. Tarazullah Samandari's nephew mentioned to the Guardian that the mason couldn't fix the problem, but the hand of the cause could. And Shoghi Effendi replied, yes, Mr. Iowis is the invisible hand of God. It was in Persian that the Guardian spoke this. And in Persian, the words, the invisible hand of God, is a reference to a Muslim tradition, a hadith, according to which the solution to an insolvable problem is the invisible hand of God. August 12th, 1955, the first shipment of Chiampo marble. You have here images of the crates of the marble arriving. And Ugo Giaccheri with the captain of the SS Nakhon, the ship that brought the marble over. So 7 months after the initial contracts were signed in Rome in January 1955, the marble arrived. The first shipment of 100 tons of marble arrived in Haifa on the 12th of August, 1955. More than 800 tons of stone were going to follow. The next month, in September 1955, Leroy Iowis wrote to the hand of the cause, Amelia Collins, we are working strenuously on the archives building. At every turn, there has been a problem after problem after problem, but it forges ahead. And some think we are making good progress. Ugo Giaccheri thinks it's miraculous. The marble work on the north podium is being completed. Next will come the marble steps and then the other sections of the podium. Some of the problems that Leroy Iowis faced, although Leroy Iowis was a phenomenally patient man, but some of the problems he faced tested his patience to their very limit. In order to shore up the archives building, the Guardian had ordered huge quantities of materials from the city, but the workers had dumped them in the wrong place, which was not helpful. Leroy was not happy. He had standards of perfection, having worked so long under the Guardian, and his own nature was the nature of a perfectionist. So this made him very, very unhappy. But in December of 1955, the very first magnificent Ionic column was placed in position on the northeast corner of the podium, facing the shrine of Bahá'u'lláh. And these are very typical Baha'i culture elements in building construction. The first sun will always face Bahjí. The column of the monument of the greatest Khalili faces Bahjí. The column of the House of Justice faces Bahjí. You know, so these are things that bring the sacred into even something as prosaic as building. 1955, Shoghi Effendi creates the gardens for the archives. This is the carved path called the Ark. And the first building on the Ark will be here. It will be the International Bahá'í Archives. This is really the Guardian's genius. It's the Guardian's innovation. It's the Guardian's fresh approach to building, which is to plant gardens before the marble from Italy had already arrived. his visionary innovation would mean that 2 years later, when the archives were completed, they were surrounded by a mature garden. And the reason that the Guardian did this is because he couldn't bear that a masterpiece of a building would be completed and surrounded by gravel and barren land. He wanted a completed building to appear, once the last stone had been placed, in a completed, beautiful garden. And this was very, very difficult for the builders, the masons, the workers, the stone cutters, everybody to do, because this is not the way most people build. And the Guardian did not care. He even once expressed his aesthetic philosophy this way. And I have taken this on as my personal motto. I will always sacrifice utility to beauty. Leroy Iowis was human, you know, and all of this placed a strain on him. This is a photograph of Leroy Iowis with Abu Khalil, and they're talking about something masonry/stone related. Leroy Iowis was indispensable to the Guardian, who said once that he did not know what he would have done without Leroy. And that once he gave something to Leroy to do, he never again worried about it. He knew it would be done. So Leroy Iowis had arrived in Haifa on the 10th of March, 1952, and he'd been working at a vertiginous rate. Insane hours, incredible load of work, so many responsibilities, from dealing with the covenant breakers and the temple land and the building of the superstructure of the Shrine of the Bab, and now the International Archives, and the building and buying tracts of land everywhere, and the Israel branches of National Spiritual Assemblies. But the most difficult for Leroy Iowis was the human emotional element. For 3 years, he'd been working on intense responsibilities while navigating the delicate balance between Western and Eastern culture, with which he was deeply unfamiliar. He had never left the United States before being invited by Shoghi Effendi to come to Israel. And not to mention, the covenant breakers took a great toll on him. After 2 years of this demanding routine, he had been ignoring his body's signs of burnout and fatigue, and he had been increasing the intensity of his activities, and it had put a severe strain on his heart. He never suffered from a heart attack, but from 1955 onwards, he would never be able to work at the pace that he had worked at between 1952 and 1955. When the Guardian heard of this, he insisted Leroy Iowis leave the Baha'i World Center for an entire month and do absolutely nothing. This is really quite wonderful, because Ruhiya Khanum often found the Guardian in the same state of exhaustion and not following his own advice, especially when she asked him to rest and he would not. So because this happened during the 10-Year Crusade, Leroy Iowis, incapable of doing nothing, said, well, why don't I become a pioneer in Europe? And the Guardian said, no, no, you are not working, you are resting, you are not going as a pioneer. By the 21st of April, 1955, the Guardian had a progress report on the archives. He said that the expropriation of the finance minister had gone through, the plot of land had been acquired, they had fixed the position of the far-flung ark, they had chosen for real the location of the building, and they had signed a $112,000 contract in Rome for the quarrying, dressing, and carving of the stones, and that they were going to be shipped within less than 2 years to the Holy Land. Now, this is sort of a, this is my chronology. So sometimes I make little asides for things that I love. This is a perfect example. architectural details of the International Bahá'í Archives. Sua Eminenza's Ciampo Pellegrini marble. Hundreds of tons of marbles were needed for the International Bahá'í Archives' 52 7-meter columns. But because Shoghi Effendi needed finished stone blocks of the same shade, and Ciampo marble was found in veins of varying shade, they had to quarry 3 times more marble than was needed for the final columns because they needed to all be the same color. You couldn't have a 7-meter column that had like a pink vein or a gray vein. It had to be that same cream color all around, and they needed 52. The marble was carefully packed and numbered. So this is column 1, portion 1, portion 2, portion 3. This is column 2, portion 1, portion 2, portion 3. So they would know exactly how to assemble them. And what was really, really cute was that when they were sent, to the Guardian, they were marked SE. And it doesn't mean Shoghi Effendi. It means Sua Eminencia, His Eminence. That's how these non-Baha'i marble workers, stone cutters, that's how they saw him. Sua Eminenza. This is so beautiful. Oh my God. This is the first completed column. Is there any way that I can show you the whole thing? Just beautiful with a man standing. You see 1, 2, 3. You can really see the 3 parts here. I'm going to leave it like this. As had been the case for the fabrication of the marble and granite of the superstructure of the Shrine of the Bab, there was a huge army of draftsmen, modelers, stone cutters, sculptors that were mobilized to make these columns. See, these are Ionic columns. Unlike the columns of the Universal House of Justice, which are Corinthian, they're very flowery with acanthus leaves. These are very simple, very beautiful. Oh God, what an inspiration it was to choose Ionic columns. When Ugo Giaccheri witnessed the first completed column erected in his presence in the yard of the Ciampo workshop, he could not believe his eyes. It was flawless. The Guardian's design was perfect. It was almost like an otherworldly experience for him. It was standing there all alone, like perfection in all of its beauty. And the workers stood around watching Ugo's expression, and they felt this mixture of awe and joy, and they were waiting for a word of praise. So Ugo Giaccheri snapped out of his dreamlike state, and he went and he shook every worker's hand, and he congratulated everyone, and he thought to himself, oh my God, what is the Guardian going to think when he sees the first column assembled? First thought was always for the Guardian. And this is just a photograph, and it's the first capital, the Ionic style capital. The capital is what goes on top of a column. So you can have an Ionic capital or a Corinthian capital. And it was done on April 19th, 1955. And each one of these, my friends, weighs 1 ton. And if you work in the imperial system, I literally cannot help you. 1 ton. 16th century inspired wooden balustrades. Shoghi Effendi, oh, he was so curious, and he was always reading books and ordering books and finding information in them. And he had found a very beautiful example of a wooden balustrade in one of William Sutherland Maxwell's books from his collection. It had been designed by a 16th century Italian architect named Palladio for a villa in Italy called La Rotunda near Vicenza. The Guardian loved this balustrade very, very, very much. So he asked Ugo Giaccheri to build a perfect replica of that 16th century wooden balustrade. Ugo immediately left for Vicenza with his new best friend, Professor Rocca, with whom he'd been working on the superstructure of the Shrine of the Bab. And they went to look at the original and study it and measure it in great detail. They took careful measurements, they made several drawings, both of which were very, very helpful to the man who eventually built this balustrade. This man we've met before in part 16. His name is Saiello Saielli of Pistoia, and he was the one who had built that exquisite door to the shrine of Baha'u'lláh. The man was a genius. His art was touched by God. So he was the one who would build this balustrade. So Saiello Saielli chose the most perfect oak, absolutely uniform in tint and in texture. And then he incorporated a variety of pretty ingenious details to make the balustrade safe. And then he spent months and months and months skillfully, but also very enthusiastically reproducing La Rotunda's wooden balustrade for Shoghi Effendi. And his final work, as always, was beyond perfect. And it was a priceless addition to the interior of the archives, because this wooden balustrade is the balustrade that goes around the top floor of the archives. The torch holders. I like this picture a lot, so I chose it, but the torch holders are these, one here and one here. Initially, the Guardian had wanted to place a large marble eagle on either side of the International Baha'i Archives, like around the main staircase or above the main staircase, the main entrance staircase, this staircase that you see here. But he abandoned that idea and decided that instead he wanted two beautiful wrought iron torch holders converted to electricity, a luminous and friendly welcome for all pilgrims. The simulated glass flames were especially made in the world-famous capital of blown glass, Murano, Italy, in Venice. So, the vestibule door, floor, and ceiling. Here you can see steel beams that are going to carry the weight of the ceiling of the auditorium of the Bahá'í International Archives. The auditorium is 10 meters wide by 24 meters long, and 30 beams, each 50 centimeters high, support the ceiling. I'll just put the picture nice and big here. The beautiful grilled inner vestibule door, so this is now the door of the archives, was a duplicate of an ancient Greco-Roman bronze door that Shoghi Effendi loved. Now you see how he goes from 16th century Italian wooden balustrade to Greco-Roman doors. And somehow it fit perfectly the style of the building. The iron frame for the window and the bronze grilled door of the vestibule were made in Italy, in Sarzana, Italy, by the firm of Malatesta, the same firm that had manufactured the lamp posts and the various gates in the holy places on Mount Carmel and Bahjí. The original floor of the archives, it was 450 square meters, and it was made of green tiles of compressed cement that were made in Italy. But when they had been installed, they didn't match the refinement of the archive's atmosphere. So they were removed and they were replaced with almond green vinyl tiles made in England by Semtex. One of the most complex and important steps in building the archives had been pouring the ceiling after the walls had been placed in position. Now, the reason that this was a problem is because they had to make sure the concrete was poured in a way that wouldn't create vulnerability in the solidity of the ceiling or crack. In order to do it properly and ensure lasting result, they first poured the lower 6 centimeters of the ceiling, then 37-centimeter high beams were poured, and finally the concrete slab 8 centimeters above that. They had to do it in stages in order to make sure it didn't break or crack or become vulnerable to the elements. The distinctive sea green roof tiles. I'm going to show you this was my picture. I want to show you just how they arrived, you know, how they just fit into each other like this. And these decorations on the roof, and then them working with the stainless steel sort of framework, and how they installed the frontispiece and all that. But because I'm going to talk about green tiles, I am going to just choose this because I love that green. It's my favorite green. After the ceiling, the next major project was the roof. 500 square meters with some 50 antifixes, these things here. Antifixes are decorations. They serve a dual purpose to embellish the roof and conceal the joint of the roof tiles. Shoghi Effendi wanted a very particular verdigris color for the roof tiles. This is called verdigris. It's kind of the color that bronze turns when it becomes green. That's the color that Shoghi Effendi wanted. And it took the factory 8 months of testing to produce the proper shade of green as identical as possible to the one Shoghi Effendi wanted. The tiles weighed 45 tons. And they had to be especially packed for shipping. Shoghi Effendi was absolutely delighted with the final tiles, the color that he had chosen on a clear blue day blended with the sky. And the roof was a masterpiece with its front and back tympana, each topped at its apex by an antheminion. This is an antheminion. And these are acroteria. These are all sort of very. So the stained glass panel, there were no pictures of the stained glass panel, so I made this in Illustrator to show you Shoghi Effendi's creation. The artist of the monumental stained glass masterpiece was Professor Gregorietti, who taught at the Palermo Accademia dell'Arti. Professor Gregorietti's specialty was producing rare and highly decorative stained glass artwork. So before the stained glass panel began, Ugo Giaccheri sent Shoghi Effendi many samples of stained glass to choose from, and Shoghi Effendi handpicked yellow, red, blue, and clear glass. During the months that Professor Gregorietti was working on the stained glass, Ugo Giaccheri traveled to Sicily several times to check on his work and ensure the quality, as well as overseeing the final packing and shipping. When the stained glass panel was assembled, it was exquisitely perfect. The door of the International Bahá'í Archives. It was a masterpiece of ingenuity, actually, because it was a Greek-style bronze double door, and it weighed 2 tons. It was faced with oak on the inside of the archives, and each of the outer doors had the same pattern, 10 square panels with studded gilded rosettes. And of course, you recognize here that it's sort of the same style as the door from the shrine of Bahá'u'lláh. And the door was built with wooden pegs and copper nails to decrease any possibility of damage produced by iron rust, and the wood was treated with a very special oil and wax. And again, the same artist made it, Sayelo Sayeli. Shoghi Effendi was able to see it in place in the early summer of 1957, just a few months before he passed away. June 1957, the completion of the International Bahá'í Archives. On the 21st of April, 1957, the Guardian announced the remaining 22 pillars of the International Bahá'í Archives, the initial edifice heralding the establishment of the Bahá'í World Administrative Order on Mount Carmel, have been erected. And this is just a photograph of the front of the International Bahá'í Archives. And this story summarizes what I've spoken about before, sort of the whole process of building, the load of marbles that have arrived and this and that. So I don't feel like we're going to miss anything if I skip this story, but I do want to talk about the Guardian's builders. These are all the photographs I could find of local workers working on the archives building. Ruhiya Khanum wrote an article in the Baha'i World Volume 13 on the completion of the International Baha'i Archives, and she made a stunning point about the team which built this incredibly beautiful work of art in just 2 years. She remarks rather brilliantly that the team that built this edifice was composed of ignorant, untrained gardeners, an Italian chauffeur, an ex-railway executive, Leroy Iowis, a PhD in chemistry, Ugo Giaccheri, and an elderly architect with little experience in such a large construction project, Dr. Andrea Rocca. It's a lesson that when there is vision, you can count on heroism. And the Guardian elicited heroism in everyone he worked with on every construction project he worked on. This is probably my favorite story in the chronology. 7 January 1957, The Pilgrimage of Charles Dunning, Part 1. I want to introduce you to a book that I want you all to buy. It's Dr. Keith Monroe's biography of Charles Dunning, published just last year in 2023. It's a labor of love and dedication, and it's filled with respect for his subject, Charles Dunning. And it was the main source of information for me in the sections that follow. An amazing, amazing book. Charles Dunning's Journey to the Holy Land. Charles Dunning had been a cook, a ship's cook in the Merchant Navy, and he pioneered to the Orkney Islands during the 10-Year Crusade and became a Knight of Baha'u'lláh. He was the first Baha'i to set foot in the Orkney Islands on the 9th of September, 1953. When Charles Dunning had discovered Baha'u'lláh enjoined pilgrimage, he wrote to the Guardian and he said, I apologize, I can't come on pilgrimage because I don't have any money. He was very, 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 very poor. And the Guardian paid for his pilgrimage and made the arrangements. Charles Dunning was supposed to sail, but he ended up arriving by plane, and he didn't have any plan of what was going to happen. But he was kind of a sweet man. And while he was in the plane, he made friends with an air hostess, and she gave him her picture. So he arrives in Tel Aviv on the 7th of January, 1951 at 11:35 a.m., and no one's waiting for him. They knew that he was coming at the master's house, but they just didn't know when. And Charles Dunning had no Israeli money. All he had was Scottish bills. He had a very, very hard time finding a taxi and exchanging them into Israeli pounds. And finally, a taxi driver liked Charles. Everybody just ended up liking Charles Dunning. So the taxi driver liked Charles Dunning so much that they stopped for tea at the start of the journey. And soon, Charles Dunning was in Haifa and his pilgrimage had begun. 7 January 1957, Charles Dunning's deeply perplexing arrival. It was very perplexing. I'll tell you why. Just before dinner, on the 7th of January 1957, the doorbell rang at the Western Pilgrim House. Leroy Iowes was the closest one to the door, so he opened the door, and he saw a very, very small man who looked like a sailor, and Ruhiya Hanum described him as looking a little bit like Popeye, the Sailor Man. And he was wearing a very large turtleneck, and he looked terrible. In fact, he looked so terrible that he looked like a homeless person. And Leroy thought that he was a bum. So he was a guy, he had rung the doorbell to ask for money. So he told him, just go around the other side. He was about to send him to the other side where people gave food to the poor. But then something changed in Leroy Iowes, and he said, yes, is there anything that we can do for you? And Charles Dunning, Knight of Baha'u'lláh, responds, I am Charles Dunning. I am the pioneer from the Orkney Islands. So Leroy Iowes just said, well, come in. He realized with shock and embarrassment that the man in front of him was a Knight of Baha'u'lláh, and he had so badly judged him. Charles entered the Western Pilgrim House, and Ethel and Jessie Ravel, the two sisters and members of the International Bahá'í Council, entered and spoke with Charles of his airplane trip and how were the friends in England. And then they said, well, we are getting ready to go down and have dinner with the Guardian. And do you think maybe you want to change your clothes and clean up a little bit for the Guardian? Charles Dunning responded, yes, I will. So Leroy asked him if he'd brought suitable clothes. Charles Dunning beamed and gesturing to his old worn suit and said, yes, I have. 7 January 1957, culture etiquette versus the Guardian's spiritual etiquette. Charles Dunning arrived for dinner dressed in the exact same clothes that he had arrived in. Ruhiya Hanum had arranged the table already in the Western way. The Guardian at his usual seat, where he could see everyone at the table. Ruhiya Hanum always sat next to Shoghi Effendi, then his other secretaries, ladies who were pilgrims who had arrived before Charles Dunning were given better seats, and Americans were seated closer to the Guardian, and Charles Dunning was seated a bit far down the table, which, it seemed all perfectly logical to Ruhiya Hanum. The Guardian arrived. He entered the dining room with his usual swish of elegance. He put his arms around Charles Dunning. He kissed him, something that the Guardian never did. And he said, with his arm around Charles' shoulder, you were a Knight of Baha'u'lláh. You deserve to be at the seat of the table. Charles Dunning was beaming, and Shoghi Effendi led him to the seat of honor immediately to his right. all the ladies had to scatter, move chairs further down the table to make space for Charles Dunning. And they were sitting there and they were watching this scene unfold. The Guardian pouring out so much love, so much respect, so much consideration, so much kindness to Charles Dunning, his Knight of Baha'u'lláh. The Guardian's understanding of proper Baha'i etiquette had been completely at odds with the etiquette of the Baha'is. They hadn't understood the station of the Knight of Baha'u'lláh. They had just organized the table according to who sat where and who arrived when. It wasn't mean per se. But Ruhiya Hanum thought to herself, now look, isn't that just typical? You have the standard of the world. You go according to your culture and your background. But this is the way it should be. Leroy Iwas learned a lesson that night too. He would later say that he felt like a 5-cent coin. He was so embarrassed at how he had initially misjudged Charles Dunning. That he had judged a Knight of Baha'u'lláh based purely on material standards. And he had seen the Guardian judge him with the standard of Baha'u'lláh. Still that same night, on 7 January 1957, Charles Dunning's first dinner with the Guardian. Charles Dunning had just imagined in his mind this whole thing about Shoghi Effendi and how the Guardian would be. He thought he would be dignified. He thought he would be serene. And when he encountered the reality of this loving, kind, emotional, sensitive Guardian, he discovered that the spiritual reality of Shoghi Effendi, and he described it beautifully. He said, he was possessed of a human touch which you could feel. And in my first meeting with him, I was happy right away. The dinner guests were fascinated. Charles Dunning was an amazing person. He sat at the head of the table watching Shoghi Effendi, his beloved Guardians, and he had his arms on the table. He was leaning in into the Guardian's personal space, wagging his finger at the Guardian, almost under his nose. And he was saying to the Guardian, Guardian, do you remember when you wrote that? Do you remember when you wrote that? The pilgrims and the staff were also fascinated because Shoghi Effendi also was leaning into Charles Dunning. That love was reciprocal. The Guardian was beaming, he was enthralled, and he too put his arms on the table, something Ruhiya Hanum had never seen him do in 20 years of marriage. The Guardian was laughing. The Guardian was joking. The Guardian was smiling. The Guardian was talking to Charles Dunning in the way that astonished even Ruhiya Hanum. Shoghi Effendi and Charles Dunning were having a wonderful, absolutely unforgettable dinner. Charles Dunning was so thrilled, he was so awestruck that he held his soup spoon. Oh, Mom, I wish I had a spoon. No, rien, ça va. He held a soup spoon. You just imagine I'm holding a soup spoon. He held a soup spoon up to his mouth, but he was staring at the Guardian. And the spoon holding the soup kept rising. And Ruhiya Hanum started panicking. She said, in one more minute, he's going to pour the soup in his ear. Oh, God, oh, God, oh, God. In the end, he's raising his soup. And in the end, when Charles Dunning saw where this soup spoon has gone, he was very surprised and he put it back in his mouth. during this dinner, Charles Dunning told Shoghi Effendi about his plane trip, and he said, I made friends with a air hostess, and you know what she did? She gave me her picture. And Shoghi Effendi asked Charles Dunning if he could have that picture. He said, "Can I have it?" Charles Dunning was overjoyed. He felt as if the air hostess he had taught the faith to had spiritually entered the faith at that moment. And he was delighted, absolutely delighted to discover that both Shoghi Effendi and Ruhiya Khanum had wonderful, very, very funny sense of humor. And he recalled that there wasn't a single dinner at the Pilgrim House when there weren't peals of laughter. This is my favorite story from the chronology. It's called Shoghi Effendi and Charles Dunning Cigarettes. Charles Dunning, a through and through Yorkshireman, was completely himself during his entire pilgrimage. He didn't pretend, he didn't change who he was. One night, he appalled every single Baha'i sitting at the table except for Shoghi Effendi with a single gesture. After the meal, Charles Dunning pulled a cigarette butt. Now, cigarettes, when they are unlit, they're about this length. But cigarette butts, the whole tobacco part has been smoked, and they're small. All that's left is like a tiny little bit of tobacco and then the filter that you smoke it with. So he pulled out a cigarette butt, and he took a needle, and he pricked the needle through the cigarette and lit it and started smoking the cigarette butt at the dinner table. The only person that was in no way shocked or appalled was the Guardian. Guardian was just very, very, very curious. He wanted to know why Charles Dunning was smoking such a small thing. Why are you smoking such a small thing? And Charles Dunning replied, "I'm a poor man, and I have to use every little bit to the last in order to get by," because he was a heavy smoker. The next evening, at the request of Shoghi Effendi, Fujita placed a new pack of American cigarettes besides Charles Dunning's dinner plate. The whole smoking incident had taught a profound and important lesson to everyone at the table, because people like Charles Dunning, who grew up in Yorkshire in like maybe the early 1900s, late 1800s, these people, they started smoking when they were 7 and they smoked through their entire lives. So by Shoghi Effendi choosing to overlook a small fault of a spiritual giant, a knight of Baha'u'lláh, a true hero of the 10-Year Crusade, who had won inestimable victories for his guardian, he was a humble and hardworking man who had given his whole heart to Baha'u'lláh. He smoked. The Guardian always focused on the inner being of the Baha'is. He loved them and he overlooked faults. The Pilgrimage of Charles Dunning, Part 2. Shoghi Effendi's ring, a gift from the Guardian. One evening, the Guardian told Ruhiya Khanum he had a stone and he wanted her to go to Haifa and have it mounted by a jeweler. So Ruhiya Khanum went and had it mounted. And when she went to the jeweler, he told her, "Oh, it's going to take a week." But Ruhiya Khanum said, "I need it today," because it was for someone who's going to be leaving in a few days. The jeweler mounted the stone on the ring while Ruhiya Khanum was in his shop. And when she returned, she showed the ring to Charles Dunning and he was delighted. Then Ruhiya Khanum put it on his finger. It was a gift from the Guardian. And this is not the ring. This is just a ring. Charles Dunning's pilgrimage experience. He stayed over one night at the mansion of Bahjí, and that would stay with him forever. visits of the holy places, the most great prison, the prison cell of Baha'u'lláh, the shrine of the Bab, the shrine of Baha'u'lláh, all of these touched his heart and soul. He was privileged to be taken on a tour of the top of Mount Carmel by Ruhiya Khanum. He even asked Shoghi Effendi, he was very independent, and he said, can I just go explore Haifa on my own without any Baha'is? I just want to walk around Haifa. The Guardian allowed it, and he was, by all accounts, he was like a really wonderful personality, and everybody loved him. So he mixed with Arabs, he mixed with Jews, he met children who could speak English. He could make friends quite easily. And that outing in Haifa was one of his favorite memories. When a man came to the shrine of Baha'u'lláh and wanted to take a picture with a pipe in his mouth, Charles Dunning asked him not to. And when the Guardian heard, the Guardian said, you know, I would have let him keep his pipe. The Guardian arranged for something meaningful for Charles, a special visit to Nazareth, so he would have something special to share with the Christians when he returned to Cardiff. And when he was in Nazareth, he visited the house of Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ. It was an infinite learning experience, and he learned a lot from the people that he met. Then one day, Shoghi Effendi showed him the scroll, the roll of honor, and the map of the 10-Year Crusade, and he showed him his name, Charles Dunning, 1953, Orkney Islands. Next to Charles is his friend, Brigitte Hasselblad, Knight of Baha'u'lláh for the Shetland Islands. So the images behind are the Orkney Islands and the Shetland Islands. But but there was a miscommunication. Shoghi Effendi told him that you were first a dot. When you arrived, you were the first Baha'i, you were a dot. And Charles Dunning heard dog. So he said to the Guardian, I didn't think you thought I was a dog. So Guardian burst out laughing, and everyone else just laughed. Then he was very proud when he heard the Guardian call him a conqueror. And Charles was looking at the roll of honor. He was, where's my friend Bridget Hasselblad? And the Guardian teased him back and said, don't you mean your girlfriend? But the best story was that happened when the Guardian shared his map of the 10-Year Crusade with Charles Dunning and the Pilgrims. And this is a story of the Yorkshire's directness and informality. The Guardian was explaining that this map showed the progress that had been accomplished, and he made a joke about the ambitiousness of the plan of the 10-Year Crusade and that it was a tough task for the Baha'is. And the Charles instant, and if he told the Baha'is how even more ambitious his plan was, the Baha'is would be upset and angry with him or unhappy with him. And Charles Dunning replied in the most Yorkshire way. He said, bunkum, Guardian, bunkum, meaning probably nonsense, nonsense. But you know what? This was a really requited love, because Shoghi Effendi loved Charles Dunning. For as long as Charles Dunning pilgrimage lasted, every night when Shoghi Effendi and Ruhiya Khanum walked home across Haparsim Street to the house of Abdul Baha, every night the Guardian would say, oh, I like that man so much. He's such a fine man. I like him so much. The Guardian never spoke of pilgrims that way. Never wanted to inflate egos, never wanted to show preference. But Charles Dunning was an exception to everything. He was an extraordinary man. After Charles left Haifa, the Guardian said, he is one of God's heroes. The pilgrimages of Ali Nakhjávání and Enoch Olinga. January 1957, the pilgrimage of Ali Nakhjávání. This is Ali Nakhjávání and his father-in-law, Musa Banani, the father of Violette Nakhjávání, the grandfather and father of Bahí Nakhjávání. Ali Nakhjávání came on pilgrimage in January 1957 with 5 other men in his pilgrim group. One of the pilgrims was an elderly gentleman, and when they arrived in front of Shoghi Effendi, he began coughing and coughing. The young pilgrims, including Ali Nakhjávání, stopped behind him. Shoghi Effendi stopped, turned, and said to the old man, "You are tired." The man answered in pure Persian fashion, "Beloved guardian, we are tired. Now that we are in your presence, all our fatigue has vanished." Oh, the guardian did not like that. He asked him, "Why did you say this?" Poor old man did not know what to do. The guardian said, "What you should have said was, we were tired, but now that we are in the precincts of the shrine of the Bab, all our fatigue has vanished." The guardian had a sense of the sacred that was absolutely unique to him. No one had a sense of the sacred like Shoghi Effendi. Then a month later, Enoch Olinga came on pilgrimage. And this is not a photograph of him on pilgrimage. This is a photograph of him in 1973. He had a very difficult trip to the Holy Land. And he had an old English passport that was expired. Ugo Giaccheri pulled all the strings and got him a new passport. And during his pilgrimage, Enoch Olinga had the bounty of spending a lot of time alone with the guardian. And he would later remember how Shoghi Effendi walked like a king. Enoch Olinga was not only the first African Baha'i to come on pilgrimage and meet Shoghi Effendi, he was also the first indigenous African Knight of Baha'u'lláh to do so. When he left, Shoghi Effendi kissed him on both cheeks. Abul Futu, father of victories. 2 days after Enoch Olinga left, the guardian secretary wrote a letter on his behalf to Musa Banani, Ali Nakhjávány's father-in-law. Enoch Olinga has achieved many victories for the faith. First in his work in Uganda, then by pioneering to the British Cameroons, becoming Knight of Baha'u'lláh there. 5 of his spiritual children went from the Cameroon to virgin areas of the 10 Year Crusade, thus becoming themselves Knights of Baha'u'lláh. He himself has confirmed 300 Baha'is with 5 assemblies. The guardian considers this unique in the history of the crusade in both the East and the West, and he has blessed the one, Enoch Olinga, who selflessly served and won these victories for the cause by naming him Abul Futu, father of victories. The guardian felt you and Ali Nakhjávání would be pleased to know this, as he is Ali's spiritual child. On the 25th of March, 1957, George Townsend passed away. He had been such a prolific writer, and he died of Parkinson's disease. 2 days after he died, the guardian called him a fearless defender of the faith. Riḍván, 1957, achievements of phase 3 of the 10-Year Crusade, the resistless march of the faith of Baha'u'lláh. This was Shoghi Effendi's very last Riḍván message to the Baha'is of the world. And he said that the accumulated evidences of the orderly unfoldment and the uninterrupted multiplication of the agencies of an administrative order designed to be the harbinger of a world civilization. The administrative order had grown, had developed, had matured. It had become, sorry, it had become something that could move the world and win victories during a crusade. I do not have the time now to read you all these numerical successes, but I hope that as I scroll through them, you understand the leadership of Shoghi Effendi, the victories of Shoghi Effendi, the firsts, the numbers, the variety, and it goes on and on and on and on. At the end of his 1957 Riḍván message, Shoghi Effendi finished with a plea to the Baha'is to remember always the most important aspect of Baha'i life is teaching. The preeminent task of teaching the faith to the multitudes who consciously or unconsciously thirst after the healing word of God in this day, a task so dear to the heart of Abdul Baha, at once so sacred, so fundamental, and so urgent, primarily involving and challenging every single individual, the bedrock on which the solidity and the stability of the multiplying institutions of a rising order must rest. Such a task, teaching, must, in the course of this year, be accorded priority over every other Baha'i activity. On the 21st of April, 1957, The Guardian received 1,000 telegrams for Riḍván. And the ones he was most excited about were the ones he received from Salzburg, Innsbruck, Milan, and Hiroshima. Isabel Sabri and Hassan Sabri came on pilgrimage between the 19th and the 20th of April, 1957. And one day, on the last night of their pilgrimage, the Guardian gave Isabel Sabri a small, beautifully inlaid Persian mosaic box wrapped in a brightly colored silk handkerchief. The Guardian opened the box and removed a folded piece of paper. On the paper, in the hand of the Qazamatul Bahar Ruhi Khanum's handwriting, was a description of the precious trust wrapped inside of it. It was a priceless piece of plaster from the ceiling of the Bab's prison cell in Maku. The Guardian asked Isabel Sabri to hand the precious box to hand of the cause Musa Benani, and instructed her to tell the hand of the cause to place it in the foundation of the Mother Temple of Africa with his own hands, and to ensure a photograph was taken of that event. June to August 1957, the institution of the Hands of the Cause in the National Spiritual Assemblies. There were added dangers to the faith. There were internal and external enemies. And the Hands of the Cause had to fulfill the primary obligation to watch over and protect the Baha'i community, but they had to do this in collaboration with national institutions that were now maturing. So both the elected and the appointed branches of the Baha'i administration were beginning to work together. And this was a very important step in the development of the faith. On the 8th of August, 1957, The Guardian wrote a letter to an African Regional Assembly on the stages of maturity. Let me just find my way here. And that they were a balance of patience, encouragement, firmness and flexibility that were needed in order for the administrative order and the Baha'i community to survive. They should be rigid in the essentials, but they should be flexible with other things. For example, they should be rigid with alcohol drinking, but they should be flexible if a guy wants to take a selfie with a pipe in front of the shrine of the Baha'u'lláh. These were important lessons that the Guardian was teaching during his last year. On the 8th of August, 1957, the importance of wisdom, patience, forbearance, and flexibility for national spiritual assemblies. Well, that just says it all. I mean, if I read this, it will be exactly what I just said, that national spiritual assemblies should practice wisdom, but they should also have patience with the believers under their care. They should have forbearance, and they should have flexibility. And flexibility is mentioned twice in this letter of the 8th of August, 1957. This is a lovely little story about the National Center of Switzerland. In the last year of the Guardian's life, sometime in 1957, 2 Swiss Baha'is came on pilgrimage, and their visit opened the floodgates of Shoghi Effendi's love for their country in an unprecedented and wholly uncharacteristic manner. The Guardian was usually deeply private about his personal life and feelings. Ruhi Hanum herself was ill when they came to visit, and so she didn't see this extraordinary conversation. She didn't hear it, but she didn't need to, because Shoghi Effendi came to her and told her, in a word, he had said everything. I've said everything. Shoghi Effendi had told the 2 Swiss pilgrims about his beloved Swiss adventures in the Bernese Highlands, high above Interlaken, his beloved city. He spoke to them about the mountains he'd climbed, his many hikes, the landscapes he loved so much. This was very unusual for Shoghi Effendi, very rare, exceedingly rare, in fact. But it affords us, in 2024, a delightful view into one of those things that he loved with all his heart and cared for so much, Switzerland and its mountains. It's a rare and it's a very stunningly clear indication of a lifelong love deep in the Guardian's heart, who always considered himself first and foremost a mountaineer. Shoghi Effendi was moved to inform the Swiss couple that he wanted Switzerland to have its own temple land, and he wanted the temple land to be located near the city of Bern, the capital, with a clear view of the Bernese Alps, where he had spent so many months of his life hiking and climbing. On the 12th of August, 1957, the Guardian's secretary wrote a letter on his behalf to the National Spiritual Assembly of Italy and Switzerland, clarifying Shoghi Effendi's wishes. So basically, he put in writing exactly what Shoghi Effendi had told him. He wanted it to be near Bern. He wanted it to have a view of the Bernese Alps. And the Guardian was offering this land as a gift to the National Spiritual Assembly. The Guardian never made an offer of buying land for a national center for any other national spiritual assembly during his guardianship. It was unprecedented, absolutely unique, and it spoke eloquently of the Guardian's deep ties with Switzerland. The Swiss temple land, almost 2,000 square meters, is located exactly where Shoghi Effendi wanted it to be. "14th of August, 1957, God will watch over them," one of the Guardian's last letters. This is the last photograph ever taken of Shoghi Effendi in 1957. It was Amatul Baha Ruhiya Khanum who took this picture. In one of his last letters to the Germany National Spiritual Assembly, which is a coincidence because the last tablet that Abdul Baha ever dictated was to the Baha'is of Germany. This is one of his last letters, but it's addressed to the German National Spiritual Assembly. The Guardian responded to 23 of their letters between 1956 and 1957. And he spoke about the attitude of the Baha'is. He does not want the friends to be fearful or dwell upon the unpleasant possibilities of the future. They must have the attitude that if they do their part, which is to accomplish the goals of the 10-year plan, they can be sure that God will do his part and watch over them. It's kind of impossible to read this and not think these are his last words. 2nd of October, 1957, the Guardian's last letter to the Baha'i world. The 1958 teaching conferences. In this last letter, the Guardian inaugurated 5 teaching conferences. One in Kampala in Africa, one in Sydney, Australia, one in Wilmette in the United States, one in Frankfurt, Europe, and one in Singapore in Southeast Asia. By the 2nd of October, 1957, there were 26 national spiritual assemblies, 117 goals opened of 131, 120 territories mentioned in the Tablets of the Divine Plan, 4,500 localities, 254 countries, 10,000 local spiritual assemblies, 100 islands, 237 languages in which Baha'i literature was translated, 48 national centers out of 49, they were missing one, 10 properties for future houses of worship, 30 countries recognizing Baha'i marriages, 45 countries recognizing Baha'i holy days, 1,000 people had visited the shrine of the Bab in 3 hours, and 27 hands of the cause. That year, in that letter, Shoghi Effendi inaugurated 2 boards. There was already 1 board of auxiliary board members for propagation. In this letter, he inaugurated a board for protection, and he said, an additional auxiliary board equal in membership to the existing one and charged with the specific duty of watching over the security of the faith. So he gave them their mandate. Let me just look real quick. Okay, so these were the 19 hands of the cause that were alive in 1957. We know them all. Amatul Bahariya Khanum, Ali Muhammad Varga, Jalal Khazeh, Charles Mason Remy, Amelia Ngendel Collins, Agnes Alexander, Tarazullah Samandari, Ali Akbar Furutan, Horace Hotchkiss Holly, Leroy Ios, Paul Haney, Herman Grossman, Musa Benani, Ugo Giaccheri, Clara Dunn, Corinne Knight True, Zikra Khadem, Shuawala Alai, Aldebert Mushlegel. But what people didn't realize is that Shoghi Effendi was going to increase that number to 27, another multiple of 9, by adding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 new hands of the cause. For West Africa, Enoch Olinga. For South Africa, William Sears and Jald Aldam Robards. For the British Isles, Hassan Muvakar Balyuzi and John Graham Farabee. For the Pacific, Harold Collis Featherstone and Rahmatullah Muhajir. And for the Arabian Peninsula, Abul Kazim Faizi. This was a watershed event. And the last gesture of the Guardian to the Baha'is was his personal representatives to the 1958 international conferences. Leroy Ios was to represent him in Asia. Charles Mason Remy was to represent him in Australia. Lutfullah Hakim and Amatul Bahariya Khanum were to represent him in Africa. Hand of the cause, Lutfullah Hakim was represented, but he wasn't a hand of the cause. Hand of the cause, Ugo Giaccheri was to represent him for the Americas Conference, and hand of the cause, Amelia Collins was to represent him for Europe. Then, in the 28th of May, 1892, from the 29th of May, 1892, when they took occupation of the mansion of Bahjí, the covenant breakers occupied that holy spot for 57 plus 8, I don't know, over 60 years. Over 60 years. And they finally vacated and returned the mansion of Bahjí into the hands of the faith. The Guardian had been fighting to rid Bahjí of the covenant breakers since 1923. It was the end of a nightmare for the Guardian. And by 11th of May, 1956, the expropriation application went through. And Shoghi Effendi turned to Leroy Ayawis and says, do you think it can be done? Leroy Ayawis replied, Shoghi Effendi, if the Guardian wants it, it can be done. The Guardian said it would be a miracle to get the covenant breakers out. But Leroy Ayawis, he has a great personality. He was always positive, he never doubted the Guardian. If the Guardian said, I don't think this can be done, he always said, you're the Guardian, it will happen, you know? So he was like the best person to have at your side in difficult moments. And they were finally expropriated. On the 8th of May, 1957, the Supreme Court of Israel, which you see here, ruled in favor of the Baha'is, and the covenant breakers were gone. So the Guardian sent a triumphant message on the 3rd of June, 1957, and he called it an epoch-making victory. For his entire guardianship, he had wanted the covenant breakers out of Bahjí, and it happened June, July, August, September, October, November, 5 months before he passed away. 5 months before he passed away. The expropriation order was enacted. And let's see. I'm going to go very quickly and summarize the last few parts because I don't want to deprive you. But I'm also conscious of the fact that I've been speaking for almost 2 hours. This is the relationship of Shoghi Effendi to the 4 mother temples. The 4 mother temples. The Mother Temple of North America. The Guardian saw second phase. He advised them until the end on what to do. Even in 1953, they said, "Oh, we want to build a library," and the Guardian advised them, "No, it's better if you do a old people's home." As far as the Temple of the Pacific, Shoghi Effendi was there when they purchased the land, and they had a convention nearby, and he advised them that he wished the temple land would be 2 to 3 acres in size. But then after that, the rest of the construction happened after his passing. The house of worship on the European continent, no one but Shoghi Effendi would have thought of building the mother temple of Europe in the country that had been the cause of 2 world wars. But Shoghi Effendi did. He was unafraid and utterly confident and possessed the capacity to see beyond normal limitations. And he wanted the design to be modern, and he allowed the believers in Germany and Austria to hold a competition, which he didn't do for other temples. And the Mother Temple of Africa, Shoghi Effendi had set his sights on Kampala. You know, it was the first place where so many victories had been raised. And Shoghi Effendi decided to have Mason Remy design it, but as with all of his designs with Mason Remy and Sutherland Maxwell, he was the pen that guided the architect. So the design is really his. And these are just a couple of stories. Shoghi Effendi's love for Africa. This is a photograph of Ali Muhammad Varga and Mihdi Samandari with the Baha'is of Nkwen, Cameroon. The growth in Africa soared during Shoghi Effendi's ministry. Thousands of people entered the faith. They were very receptive. There were so many communities. And it was really the continent that in the last years of his life brought him so much joy. And in fact, he praised the African continent. He said it had remained uncontaminated by the evils of gross, rampant, and cancerous materialism. He has a lovely statement here on Africa, and here also, and here and here. I compiled all the statements of The Guardian. This is the participants of the First National Convention of Northwest Africa. And sorry. And The Guardian always became very happy when he heard news of his secretary said the work in Africa, and more particularly in Uganda, is very dear to his heart. He feels that this country and its people are the very heart of Africa, are his most precious trust. So much love. Shoghi Effendi's victories in Africa were really about Ali Nakhjávány's mass teachings in Kampala, and when 2,000 people became a Baha'i. And he would tell Ruhiya Khanum, when he was happy like this, he would tell Ruhiya Khanum, if I were happy, you would see what I could do for this cause. Let them make me happy, which is deeply heartbreaking. The achievements of the Guardian's ministry. These are numerical achievements. I will refer you to the chronology to look at them. The number of islands, the number of local spiritual assemblies, 89% of the goals. These kinds of things, they don't translate well in talks. But I do want to talk to you about something that I find very interesting, is something that is highlighted by the brilliant, amazing, wonderful, extraordinary Ali Nakhjávání, who says that he was able to find 6 unique concepts in the writings of Shoghi Effendi. The one concept is the 7 stages that national communities experience as the faith moves from obscurity to formal recognition and their establishment as supremacy. Step 1 is obscurity. Step 2 is persecution. Step 3 is emancipation. Step 4 is recognition. Step 5 is establishment. Step 6 now is the Baha'i state. And step 7 is the Baha'i civilization. According to Ali Nakhjávání, these 7 steps are not found in the writings of Baha'u'lláh or Abdu'l-Baha. Now, the second unique concept in the writings of Shoghi Effendi is the idea of Baha'i cycles, Baha'i dispensations, Baha'i ages, Baha'i epochs, and Baha'i phases. These are not mentioned in the writings of Baha'u'lláh or Abdu'l-Baha or the Bab. The Guardian, number 3, came up with the term teaching and consolidation. Before the Guardian, that did not exist. Number 4 is quite interesting. It's the 9 concentric circles that we looked at when we saw the building of the Shrine of the Bab. You know, the outer circle is the planet, and then the Holy Land, and then Haifa, and then the outside of the Shrine of the Bab, and then the inside of the Shrine of the Bab, and then the inner chamber, and then the sarcophagus, and then the coffin. That is an original concept by Shoghi Effendi. Concept number 5 is, despite the exalted station of the Shrine of the Bab, it is still under the shadow of the Shrine of Baha'u'lláh, the most holy shrine. So that particularity, that concept of one shrine being above another, that is from Shoghi Effendi and not anyone else. And the last original concept of Shoghi Effendi is the Bab as the fruit of the Adamic cycle. So the Adamic cycle developed, and the Bab was born out of the Adamic cycle, and he is the one who makes the connection between the Adamic cycle and the Baha'i cycle. And that is also a unique concept by the Guardian. One of the things that I think I might show you is, we've talked so much about the development of the administrative order and the expansion of the worldwide community, is the Guardian's development of the Baha'i World Center. 1957, the International Baha'i Archives. 1939, the Monument Gardens. 1953, the Shrine of the Bab. Now, dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this. I apologize. I spoke for 2 hours. I did not want you to miss beautiful things like the pilgrimage of Charles Dunning, and I could not abbreviate it. Next week may possibly be a little bit shorter, maybe as long. We meet again next Sunday for my least favorite part, the passing of Shoghi Effendi, part 21. This is going to be very hard for me, and it's going to be very hard for you. I want to thank you all for having come today. I send you all my love wherever you are in the world. And now I guess we're going to stop recording.